And we're going to talk about the crosswalk that identity and culture has that impacts instruction and learning. We have a video here. It's a short video that we are going to have you watch. This is by Dr. Christopher Emden.
You know, I'd like to be able to sit in a space with the Secretary of Education and say, listen, I know you're well-intentioned, but what you're doing isn't working. The world of education has not had a revolutionary approach to science education since the 1950s in the post-Sputnik era. So it hasn't worked, and that's why we need something new. We've tried changing curriculum. We've tried changing standards. We've tried electing new presidents. We've had No Child Left Behind. We've had Race to the Top, Race Around the Block, All Children Left Behind. I mean, we've had all these ridiculous ideas that are well-intentioned about how to improve education. But the only thing that we have not had a concerted focus on yet, we haven't focused yet on the culture of young people. And I argue that this is the last hurrah. You know, everything else has not worked. So let's focus on using culture as an anchor for instruction, because if this doesn't work, then we're doomed. You know, I'd like to be able to sit in a space with the Secretary of Education and say, listen, I know you're well-intentioned, but what you're doing isn't working. If you just teach the teachers about their content and you don't teach them how to understand the culture of young people and understand the realities of young people, we're creating a whole new cadre of teachers who will go into classrooms and still be ineffective. I want to talk to people who are recruiting teachers from some affluent backgrounds and Ivy League institutions into urban schools to say, if you don't prepare those teachers to understand the culture of young people and immerse them in hip-hop culture, they're going to fail. I want to say, look at what you've done. Look at the fact that teachers coming to these schools in urban settings work for a year or work for a year and a half or 2 years and then go on to law school. Why do you think they're unsuccessful? And then they leave and they tell these horrible, horrific stories about their experiences in urban schools, not because of the brilliance of the young people, not because of the intelligence of the young people, but because they were
Sorry about that. I think I might have shared the earlier one as a
people.
as the wrong slide deck. So we're going to move out of Pear Deck for right now and just go for Google Docs, if that's okay with you, Corinne.
That's fine. Apparently, Pear Deck has decided it no longer wants to work for us today. Yes, Anna, his book is amazing.
With hip-hop artists are Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul and like you know, I grew up in an era where I have a certain brand of hip-hop that I love. The young people that I deal with every day and work with, they are hip-hop culture as well, but they have the artists that they attune themselves to. If I went into the classroom with my perception or my misperception of what hip-hop is, or my nostalgic perspective of what hip-hop is, I couldn't be truly a reality pedagogue. That I always have to be teaching. I always have to be learning about the culture of young people. I always have to be learning about how hip-hop evolves and transforms, because that's the beauty of the culture. That it always evolves, it always revolves, it always recreates and reforms itself in this beautiful way, but yet still ties into what makes it what it is. One thing that I have to mention is our Twitter group, Hip Hop Ed. So every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, I have worked with a bunch of educators, Tim Jones, Emil Cook, Sam Seidel, who are amazing hip-hop educators, to create this space where anybody who's interested on the intersections of hip-hop and education can converge on Twitter and have a conversation about hip-hop. The questions can be, what is a rap cipher? Or what is a battle? Or how do I use this Jay-Z lyric in my classroom? To, you know, how does science and hip hop really connect? So every week we come up with a question, we attack it from multiple angles. We have people across the globe who are hip hop educators who come on Twitter every night to learn more about the intersections of hip hop and education. This is a movement. It's the next phase of the work of education, and I'm so excited to be a part of it. I'm Christopher Emden, and you are watching Epiphany.
So those of you who have ever heard of Dr. Christopher Emden or have had the chance to hear of the book or even to read the book For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too, anybody has heard of Dr. Emden or read the book, can you give me a thumbs up in your reactions? Thank you, Tina, for your comment. I love that you are 61 and loving some Ludacris. I mean, he is amazing. So if you have had the pleasure to hear any more of Dr. Emden's speeches, I follow him on Twitter as well. If you get a chance to read the book, it really is a powerful book to read, and to hear his stories about urban education and how we can best do what we can for students to bring culture into the classroom, because it is extremely important, as we are going to talk through what we're going to talk about today. So let's first get into a little bit of some definition about reality pedagogy. So according to Dr. Emden, who is the one who coined this phrase, it is the teaching method that focuses on the cultural understandings of student within a particular social space. So that classroom being that social space, and the idea of bringing their culture. And as we talk through this, we're going to talk about that word culture and what it truly means, more than just what most of us attune to culture. So there are 5 elements to reality pedagogy, and he calls them the 5 C's. Okay, cogenerative dialogue, co-teaching, cosmopolitanism, context, and content. So cogenerative dialogue, that is a structured dialogue that builds on a student's identity. In this case, when he talks about it, he talks about that hip hop culture, that familiarity with hip hop being a communal tradition, and talking about ciphers or codes, and having that dialogue be a piece of a long-standing ritual in hip hop and in culture. Co-teaching, when he's speaking of this, he speaks of encouraging students to be the expert in pedagogy, while the teacher is actually a novice. And thinking about, I'm sorry, I just saw that chat and it made me giggle, because that is, that was funny. Shorty is your girlfriend. Yes. Co-teaching allows teachers to learn how students learn from one another, and importantly, how their learning style provides an opportunity to reflect their reality in their lives, and again, bring it into the classroom. Cosmopolitanism, excuse me, as my tongue gets tied there, is based on a philosophy that human beings are responsible for each other, and that individual differences should be valued. Context refers to connecting students' home lives and cultures to the classroom, and really building that community piece. Thinking about having students bring pieces of their culture and their identity into the classroom, and then they have those artifacts that are in the classroom that they can talk to, and they can explain to each other why those artifacts are important to their culture and where they come from. And the last piece, the content of it, is the willingness for the teacher to acknowledge their own limitation as far as their content knowledge, and working with students to explore what learning is in a content-based way. I'll pass it on to Matt so we can talk about identity.
So one of the things that we think about when we talk culture and cultural relevance is the need to understand who we are as people. We can't do cultural work without or talk about what the kids are before we identify who we are. So identity, according to Wikipedia here, is the qualities, beliefs, personality, looks, and expressions that make a person or group. One can regard the awareness and categorizing of identity as both positive or as destructive. So we have this whole idea of identity and who we are as people. But there is also, our identity is not a easy thing to talk about. So when I come into a room, if you've ever met me face to face, or even through Zoom, right now I'm leaning back, but I am a white male, and that impacts how people see me. I am in my 30s. I come from a middle class culture, my middle class economic class. My culture tends to be, I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and it has a part of an Eastern Shore of Maryland piece. My ethnicity is Italian American. I have taught, as I said, I always talk about how long I've taught with people, because that's part of who I am. Part of my education matters. The fact that I don't necessarily have a disability that is identified is part of how people interact with me. And we all look at these pieces coming together. We have to recognize that identity is all of these things. All of these things make us who we are. Corinne, do you want to let them know who you are?
Sure. I am a white female. I was raised by two teachers, so I was also what you would consider middle class. I am in my early 40s. I like to say early just to make sure everybody is on the same page, right? Okay. I have two master's degrees. I'm currently working on a doctorate. So my education is something that I value and want to bring to the table so people know, again, who am I when I'm coming into a room. I am Polish, Irish, and the other side of my family is pretty much European mutt. So I can't even own all the pieces of that. And again, same with Matt, the fact that I don't have a disability that has been recognized, my ability is something that I have been aware of most of my life, and therefore have taken steps to make sure that I can come into a room and understand that not everybody has the same places or comes from the same places that I come from.
So what we're going to ask you to do is take a piece of paper and reflect how you show up professionally when it comes to your identity. So take some time and think about, when you walk into your classroom, how do you show up to your students and to the parents that you work with? We're not going to ask you to share it. So this is a self-reflection piece more than anything else. Tina gave us a great example right there in the chat. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. So when we think about all of these pieces, we have to think that we tend to put people in buckets. That's how we all live. Oh, he's this or she's that. And when we put people in buckets, we lose a lot about the person. When we silo people, oh, that's your special ed teacher. How many special ed teachers get annoyed when someone says, but they're your students? They're not my students. Really, they're everybody's students. And when we think about culture, we have to think about intersectionality, because the way I walk in a room depends on a lot of little pieces like this that are who I am. So I can walk into a room and I'm not just Matt McLaughlin. I am as much a very large white man who's telling people what to do. Like, that happens. That's what I was as a teacher at times. And that impacts how people look at you. They tended to put me where there were going to be fights. They liked putting all the big guys around the fight areas. They use that intersectionality for that piece. When we think about ourselves and our students, who are we and how do those intersectionalities align in the way we act? Does someone identify within their sexual orientation or the religion, or how do those pieces come together in ourselves so that we understand our own intersectionality, how all of the items on this wheel come together to show who we are and how people perceive us. So intersectionality is really important for us to understand, because that is where we come from. And we can't have empathy for others until we have empathy for ourselves. We have to know who we are before we can say, this is what we're seeing. And we build that by being aware and talking about these issues. But we have to be aware of how we present in a room. I joked with Corinne about this presentation. I said, so the white guy is going to start talking about intersectionality. I made this point to my student. White boys, when I taught social studies, when I taught history, white boys about to talk about slavery. Let's talk slavery. And it made the point that I may not understand all the perspectives. I can research them. I can pull together those things, but I can't necessarily feel all of the impacts. So when we think about this, when we show up in our classrooms, and you can put this in the chat, how does your identity, or if you want to give us like one example, how it shows up into your classroom? How does your identity show in your classroom? You can unmute if you want. You can type in the chat. You can do a lot of different things.
Liz, loose, you're not.
Okay.
You're
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just clicking on the microphone, and okay, guys. Like you can hear, I got my accent too. I'm from another country. I don't come with closed captions. So if you don't get something, let me know. I try to repeat it more clear. Okay. Talking about culture. I'm from Puerto Rico. I came to live in a big city, New Jersey, close to New York, where we get a little bit of everything. Then moved like 24 years ago to PA. Different culture, different more conservative. work with kids all my life, work with kids. Only 1 year and a half to retirement, and that's great. I'm like, yay. So still feel pressure because my outside, like I work with deaf people, and deaf people, most of my time I work with deaf people, but now I'm working with deaf and blind. Thank God the blind ones, they cannot see the outside. So the deaf ones, they get confused because when they send me to them, they're expecting to see a white person that only can speak sign language. And they said to me, oh, wait a minute, they sent me the wrong interpreter. They sent me a Spanish one. We don't need, I don't speak Spanish. And I'm like, no, no, no. Um, Something magical is gonna pass really quick. I'm gonna learn sign language and you and me gonna communicate really quick. And they're like, oh, you know sign language. And it's culture. Always my life has been culture. And even in my own house, because having a deaf daughter, learning deaf culture and having a second kid after her, my husband and myself, we decide to speak only English at home because not leaving my deaf daughter out, because when we don't sign, she depend on reading lips. And my little boy only hear English, 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 closed caption in English, everything in English. So he doesn't speak a lot of Spanish. So I was just telling my husband the other day, oh my God, this is life is not being fair with me because any of my kids speak my own language. you know and when I go to a classroom, I always think about myself. This kid is somebody's call, and he's a kid, and I'm just going to start earning my trust with him. I don't see him differently like other kids, like color, or but I know he's coming from a place that probably is different than mine, and I'm going to have to learn from him, and he's going to be very surprised learning from me. So it's just a new beginning from both, from that's the way I see it. And I present myself as a professional. I got my experience, my ups and downs, and so many years, early intervention programs, deaf and hard hearing, blind, and different places, whatever they need you, they just poop. And it is what it is. We do the best we can with the tools that we have, and with the knowledge that we have. That is the knowledge. There's no price for that. You're gonna take care everywhere you go. So that's my experience, that's my own opinion. Nice meeting you all.
You're
Thank you
great.
for
No, thank
sharing.
you so much for sharing. We truly appreciate it. I'm also watching the chat as people share how where they came from and what they do impacts the way
Hmm.
they work, the way they teach, and thinking about their culture really matters. And I'll give you an example very early on. I was so stunned. I walked into a school when I was a student teacher, and they had a Bible opened up on the front desk of the school, and it wasn't a private school; it was a public school, and that told me a lot about the culture of that school. The Bible was up front. There was a Christmas tree. Back in the back of the office, there was a menorah. So it said something about what was going on. When we think about identity, it really does impact how students see us. It impacts how parents see us. When I was a young teacher, I had parents say, well, you're not a parent, so you'll never know what this actually means. So you need to sit down and not tell us about our child. And that impacted the fact that I don't have children impacts how parents see me, how parents saw me at the time. Or how young you are, or how old you are. And all of these things impact, and that identity influences how we work in our classroom. How do your students' identity, how does that impact how they show up?
I had a conversation with a young man and a coworker of mine. It went on for days at lunchtime because he couldn't understand how we were both married to our children's fathers. And both of us were it was really important to keep us like a calm face and not judge him. And he was not making fun of us or being a Weisenheimer, nothing like that. He just, in his world, that was an absurd concept. And so, you know, it took him a really, really long time to understand that I was married to my husband for 40 years and every one of my children are also his children. Like he just couldn't understand that. And because she and I came at it with no judgment, like he is so, like he told our school psychiatrist that like we are the only two people he trusts, and he got, you know, and that I really believe that that's why, because we didn't like just say we were right and you were wrong and that's a ridiculous thing and or whatever, be judgy. And I think that's my most important thing is don't be judgy. If you can take your ego out of it and don't be judgy, you're gonna make some great progress with your student.
I agree with that 100%. Thank you, Tina.
Anyone else want to share before we move on? So we're getting into this idea of what we can do. The first thing we can do is really understand ourselves and then start talking to our students. But we also have to consider a number of things. A lot of this is coming from the work of Ladson Billings, the work of Stevens. This is coming out of culturally relevant teaching from Guy. This is coming out of culturally relevant pedagogies or culturally sustaining pedagogies. And this is one of those pieces. So one of the things that we need to be aware of, especially in a building that covers 3 counties, we have rural, we have urban, and then we have urban. We have those kids that are right on the outskirts of urban areas, and that each of these groups may have different cultures. A student from, let's say, Redline might be different than a student from York from their cultural perspective of what they've seen. We may consider what our personal bias is. And for this, I do want to start with saying that there is, when we talk bias, we're talking about our likes and dislikes. We're talking about things we think. And we need to be aware of our own biases as we walk into a building. As Tina said, don't be judgy. We have to be aware that we have biases, because we all live in that world of we have things that we think because of how we grew up. One of my biases, and I'm free to admit this, and it's something I'm working on, I use guys. I've been working on it 10 years to stop use guys from coming out of my mouth.
That's just our inner Philly, Matt. We can't help it. We try real hard. I got it too.
And it's that little bit, but in a group of people. When I looked at my class and said, hey guys, and I got these looks from my female students, and they went, yeah, when I moved down to Eastern Shore, Maryland, I taught, and they weren't used to guys being a generalized term for everyone. They kind of came at me that day. And it made me aware that that was one of my habits that I needed to do. And it's those, sorry, did my sound go bad? Am I back?
No.
Back to you, Corinne.
All right. So picking up on where Matt left off, hopefully his sound, yeah, I don't know. Does my sound all right? Are we good? Okay. Not sure. We're in the same building, but we're all in different locations. So who knows what is happening. So talking about the cultural relevant teaching aspect of this, and again, just kind of emphasizing a little bit of what Matt said, it is very important to understand your bias before you realize, well, first of all, to realize you have it. Everybody has it. And again, it's not bad. It's not, nobody's shaking a finger at you and telling you that you shouldn't feel this, that, and the other. You have to know that you have it in order to make yourself better, right? You don't know better until you don't do better until you know better. So that's where we are in this work. It's very important to understand when we're talking about culture, we're not talking about just race. We're not talking about just ethnicity. We're talking about all of it as a conglomeration. And culture can also merely just be what block you live on. Anybody that's from an urban area or have taught in an urban area, you can definitely back me up with saying, you have students that say, oh, well, I live on the 600 block of King Street. And then you've got your kids that live on West King versus East King, and that's going to be completely different too. So there is a whole lot of layers to this that go along with that intersectionality piece of it, that it's not just race, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just one of these things, it's all of these things.
This could be as simple as gender as well. Can you hear me now? Am I good?
No. Yeah,
My
and
connection.
the gender thing is not simple either. There are over 120 different gender, whatever they're called. I'm just lost the word as I'm trying to think. Sorry. About how, thank you. Just identity. Oh, great. Different identities that people can choose from. And a lot of times people don't realize that it's more than just male, female. It's more than, has a lot more to do with how you identify. And then the ability level of it, those of you that are teaching in special ed classrooms, or you have classrooms where you are servicing populations of kids that have various needs, all of that comes into play, because on top of those needs that they might have in a special ed classroom, there are all these other layers of it that come into culture. So let's talk about identity before instruction. So on the next slide, we have a graphic that we created based on some information that we found in a really great article that is also in the folder, that you can read, and it's about exploring equity issues. So believing first that understanding this identity comes before instructing students. So we have to understand what students' culture is, what their identity is, before we can instruct them, before we can make real learning happen. But all of these pieces, self-efficacy or competence, which is feeling capable to complete tasks, plus the idea of relatedness, how they belong to the environment that is around them, that school community, that classroom community. Added to that, their feeling of autonomy, whether they feel independent, whether they can make choices. Do they have a voice? Do they have choice in your classroom? All of that goes together to also build cultural relevant teaching within a classroom. So we'll break down each of these pieces, the competence, the relatedness, and the autonomy, a little bit here. So we know that you consider all of these things. Okay, and on the next slide, we are going to ask you again if you can drop into the chat. Sorry that the Pear Deck isn't working. What are you already doing in your classroom that incorporates identity and cultural relevance with your interactions with your students? Because I'm sure you're already doing something that is working. So we encourage you to drop something into the chat, please. Thank you.
I'll check in. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Yes, I love these things in the chat. It's awesome.
Ryan, thank you for that.
I was just about to say the same thing, Matt. Active listening, very important. Asking questions, right? Getting to know who is around you. What can they bring to the table that's different from you and different from other people around them? Love it. Thank you guys for your great interaction in the chat. That's awesome. Thanks.
And as the last, Tina, again, awesome. Something to talk to them about too would be thinking on what are the facial visual cues that they give based on their culture, because cultures have different cultures may have different hand motions. Coming from an Italian household, me moving my hands this much made sense, but if some people, if I was gesticulating very closely or in a room, I'm a big guy with big arms, for some people that is kind of intimidating. So being aware of that has always been something I've been trying for.
Yep. That's funny.
So one of the things that we need to bring to students is this idea of competence or self-efficacy, that idea that they are able to complete a task. So we want to give students skill level tasks that they can complete. When we're talking about working with students, no matter what culture they're in, setting them up for success, success breeds success. We want people to think they can be successful. It's more than just working with them. It's allowing them to be successful and owning their success. Working with. So building tasks in that they can be successful in, letting them build up, because part of our identity is our academic identity. What identity do we want kids to have? What identity are we going to try to foster? If kids come to us with an academic identity, as many of them do, of I can't, or I'm no good, or I won't, it becomes very difficult to teach. So we start with that academic identity. Relatedness is another big piece to that. Corinne, do you want to talk to this one?
Sure. So when we think about relatedness, and you think, again, I said about choice and voice, but also having students work together collaboratively. Again, you're building a community in your classroom. You want your students to feel comfortable with each other, to make it a safe space so that they feel they can truly be a part of the learning. And all of that collaboration can, again, really only start if it's a safe space and they feel that their choice is heard, their voice is heard, and that you're giving them choices that are based on their interest. So we don't want to think about, so, you know, there are a lot of really good observations in the chat about multicultural books and things, but we want to also think about, do the students identify with some of the choices that they are given? example would be that one of the books that the book club where my daughter is going to school last year, they were reading a book about a kid in Harlem. Now this was book club, so this was outside of her ELA classroom, but it was hard for her to identify with the characters in the book. Even though my children are biracial, it is hard for them at times to identify with some of the things that this student was going through, because she's never lived in the projects. She's never been to Harlem. A lot of the things they talked about in the book were things that she had never been a part of because of her growing up in a middle class white neighborhood mostly, and going to a school where, though a lot of the other students have brown faces, they are all different types of socioeconomic class and ethnicity and race. So thinking about just being purposeful about what you are bringing into the class. That's why the idea of having students bring in their own artifacts or maybe books that relate to their own culture, and then giving them that choice and voice can really be important and very important to the relatedness of their academic identity.
Student voice becoming part of your class is also really important with this. Allowing students to argue and argue back at you, and allowing them to place their own beliefs and their own identities into the classroom. Students should have the chance to be part of the conversation as much as humanly possible. And student voice is important in that when we think PBIS, or we think any discipline or how we set up the classroom, how much student voice are we putting into that? Are we allowing the students to explain why they did something before we say that was wrong? And giving them that open forum to argue with us in a controlled and respectful manner. Another big piece is autonomy. Students need to have those autonomous actions and be able to make decisions for themselves. We can give them decision charts, we can give them goals, but I could make goals for every person that I know. That doesn't mean those goals are going to stick. As a classroom teacher, I built goals around what I wanted students to do, but they didn't do it until it became their goal. They had to own it. They had to be autonomous. They had to have that belief that they can reach their goals as well. So we had to make sure that the autonomy and the choices they made sometimes were positive, but also giving them that chance to fail and pick themselves up and move forward and have those deeper conversations about who they are as a person, that failure isn't part of their identity. It is a step towards success, and building in that growth mindset.
And Tina, to your point in the chat, if you're coming to Phyllis and my session later on restorative practices, winky, winky, if you want to, talking about the idea of what happened and how other people reacted to that, how it made other people feel. That's going to be a very important piece in building that classroom community, building these relationships that a lot of you are talking about, which again is phenomenal.
Well, we spend a lot of time in our classroom too. Our kids are lower functioning. So we spend a lot of time when we make a mistake, talking about how we made a mistake. Oh, can you make a mistake? Sure. You know, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then teaching them about what the mistake was, how you can correct it, and the fact that everybody does make mistakes. It doesn't make you less of a person to make a mistake, right?
one of the kids in our class doesn't like to be called dude. And it just so happens that my teacher and myself are of the dudette generation. And it's so hard not to call him dude. And, you know, we constantly tell, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, it's just, you know, like trying to undo what you know, like it's just part of your vocabulary.
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
like Matt and I said with "use guys."
right. And he'd get so angry at first, and now he laughs at it because, you know, like he sees that we're like, oh my gosh. No.
And that shows that you've built that relationship, which is what this is all about.
Yep.
I was in a classroom with someone who was non-binary gendered, and I made the mistake when writing to the student's parent, and I think I used she, and they went by a different pronoun, and I got this massive email back about that mistake and how horrible I am. And I went to the student and apologized, and they looked at me and said, I don't have a problem with you. I know it was a mistake. Let me go. I will tell my mother to lay off a little bit on you because that wasn't the issue. But the ownership of that feeling is important. And that relationship that you build just by talking about students and where they're coming from is super important. I'll let Corinne go with this because I don't want to risk my phone dying on me.
That's fine. So some of the other things that we can do, again, bringing in culturally relevant articles, but culturally relevant articles that build on the identity of students that are already within your classroom. So we said that first step is relationships. So that means asking questions, getting to know your students, getting to know what is their identity, what is their culture, what do they identify most with, and then bringing some of that into the classroom and asking them again, student voice and choice. Why don't you guys bring in an article for this week and let's talk about what that relevance is to what we are talking about in our lesson for, you know, ELA or social studies, or how can we crosswalk that with some of our other subjects. Again, we've talked about this a bunch of times, building community. Classrooms and schools are communities, and we have to encourage that outside community is coming into the school and the classroom, and we are allowing that to happen, and we are bridging that, and we are talking about what is your outside community, how does it fit into the inside community, how can we create a collaboration and a relationship with one another in the classroom. Engagement strategies for discussion. So we put Castle's SEL playbook in here. We all know that right now, everybody's social emotional well-being is of the utmost importance. We need to talk about how we are feeling. Again, that is a place that if people are caught in, if it's like a mud place that they can't get out of, there's no learning that's going to happen. So if you create space for those conversations to happen and create grounding activities and talk about whatever might be bothering them, again, confining that to an academic place can sometimes be really hard. You have to know where to stop it and when to get the conversation moving back towards school, but you have to give some space to students to talk about what's going on in their lives in order to get them to get to a place of learning. And then we've been talking a lot. On the next slide, we have moments of genuine connection. Miss Phyllis is here, and she is our moments of genuine connection guru. Matt, if you can pop to the next slide. So if you're in a virtual space, hopefully some of you are face-to-face, but if you are virtual, think about what it was like when students were not virtual and you had them coming into your classroom before the bell rang and you were talking to them and you were just checking in. How was your weekend? How was your evening? Oh, you had soccer practice last night? How'd you do? You know, things like that. All of those pieces build that relationship. So if we think about that in a virtual space and we create waiting rooms and we are having people come into our Zoom room from the waiting room as they're coming in, identifying the student by name, doing check-ins, doing check-outs, doing them every class period so that we are ensuring that all of that space has been created and you're creating those connection moments with your students. And more importantly, they're creating that relationship with you. Giving varied feedback, written feedback, video feedback, audio feedback. We have all of these great pieces of technology now. If we can thank COVID for one thing, it's thanking it for the fact that we can now really have different conversations with students and use technology in a very purposeful and meaningful way in order to reach students that maybe we might not have reached before. Kids that don't want to raise their hand in your class, or students that don't have the ability to speak, or they don't want to speak because they are afraid of whatever might come out, you know, or somebody making fun of them. Again, the safe space is created by some of these technological pieces. Incorporating interests, using humor, building off collective experiences. Though we are all different, there's probably a lot that we might have in common. So when you build that relationship, really hone in on those commonalities and talk about what you guys might have in common. Keeping a document or keeping track of things about your students that you can come back to, that builds that social capital. So you're putting a penny in because maybe one day you might have to draw out $5, right? You need to bring it back. Sorry, I'm reading the people and saying stuff in the chat. So I love that people are milling about and listening and commenting on the session. That's amazing. Tell them to come on in. It's a community, right? We want their feedback as well. So we have two other links in here about creating moments of genuine connection, both online and then some check-ins above that you can feel free to click on and use. And again, we will pop the Google slide deck into the chat, so you will have that again if you didn't get that earlier. And again, sorry, the Pear Deck did not work. So we have some other SEL resources in here, some reflection prompts. We have a virtual calming room. I'm not sure if anybody in here has ever used a virtual calming room. I had not ever used one virtually, but I can imagine when I was teaching emotional support classrooms, this would have been very, very helpful. We had sounds and music in our calming room. We had one that was adjacent to our room. So you can see Matt pulled it up. There are some nice sounds and music in there that you can use. There's visual relaxation, there's guided practice, which has journaling, and there's some other resources which are really great.
And couldn't we all use some virtual calming every now and then?
I listen to, it's called Insight Timer. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that. It's a free app on my phone. I listen to that to go to sleep. Sometimes it's talking, sometimes it's music, and just something like that in your classroom could be really beneficial. Yes, the Calm app is also good. And then we have another link in there for some writing prompts. So these writing prompts can be used not only in ELA, but they can be used in other subject areas. And they have to do with social emotional pieces and self-awareness.
And if your students are not really into the writing, if you have multiple disabilities or you have other hindrances to writing, we can always use these with a Flipgrid where they can record themselves and say it out loud.
Right.
So it doesn't always have to be something written. So we can utilize that technology that we have suddenly dropped ourselves into to be more open to alternate means. Because there are a lot of students who hate to write, but would love to tell you about their day or love to answer these questions in a verbal manner.
Yes. Thank you, Matt.
So let's, instead of using this pear deck, I'm going to ask you to do a waterfall activity. So we'll give you a minute on a timer. I have my watch on me, so I can do a minute on there. And I want you to think about, and you can type in the chat your takeaway, your most important thing that you found from today's lesson or today's presentation. And then at 1 minute, I'm going to ask you to hit enter, and we're going to blow up the chat with 53 takeaways. I think we were somewhere around there last time I looked.
So don't hit enter until Matt says go. So you have a full minute to type.
So we'll start the minute now. Fifteen seconds. 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hit enter. Now I need a second to go through some of these. These are amazing. Thank you so much for your participation today. That has been so important to this session and all of the sessions as we moved forward. One of the things we wanted to talk to you about is on February 25th, we are doing this session, but we're doing it across a whole day. So it'll be a lot more depth to those conversations. So if this is something that you would like to be part of, you can speak to your supervisor. We're doing it as a half asynchronous and a half synchronous. So you'll have 3 hours to do, and then 3 hours would be face-to-face through Zoom. So feel free to check that out. Our attendance code is 2631, and our evaluation. So the attendance, you're waiting to the very end and gathering all your numbers together. And then the only thing we're asking you to do before you go today, ask us any questions or thoughts you have. And also please fill out our evaluation. We're always striving to do better and be better at our end. So if you could fill out the evaluation and give us any thoughts or what you think, we would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you for all the participation.
Yes, thank you for coming, and we will keep the room open until 2:25. So we're opening the space. If anybody has questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to stay around and unmute yourself. We would greatly appreciate it.
Please hold off on doing the evaluation. It seems we have the wrong link in there.
Oh, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you would just change Corinne, change Des Arnold to Matt McLaughlin, I would appreciate it. And we can make any other changes on our back end that we need. So thank you again. 2631. The link, the attendance code is 2631. I'm going to put it in the chat for you one more time. Can you hear me, Dawn?
Yes.
I think everyone muted their sound all of a sudden.